In a near-future world, we see an interstellar spaceship named Avalon gliding through space, en route to a new colony called Homestead 2. This massive spaceship operates on autopilot with its cabins empty, as all its 5,000 passengers and 258 crew members sleep in deep hibernation. However, this journey is suddenly interrupted when Avalon enters an asteroid belt. Although the ship's shields absorb the initial impacts, a massive asteroid breaches the defenses and collides with the ship, triggering a cascade of malfunctions inside. In response, the ship initiates automatic repairs, but one critical failure causes one of the hibernation pods to malfunction, waking Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer who was initially disoriented. However, he is guided through the awakening process by the automated system, which informs him that he's been in suspended animation for 120 years and is now just 4 months from Homestead 2. Relieved and eager, Jim begins to explore his surroundings, while anticipating the company of other passengers. In the meantime, he receives a briefing about his ID band, cabin, and the ship's luxurious amenities meant to prepare him for life on the new planet. However, his excitement was short-lived when he attended an orientation class that was supposed to be for a large group, only to discover that he was the only one around. During the lectures, a hologram explains Earth's deteriorating conditions, overpopulation, and high living costs. However, it continued to ignore Jim's questions about why he is the only one around. Eventually, he grows frustrated and decides to search for other passengers. That is when he finds that the main concourse is empty. However, an automated help desk tells him to find a steward for help. As he tries to follow the instructions, he discovers that the crew is also missing from the control room, and even when he reaches the bridge, he finds that no one, not even the captain, is awake. Now deeply worried about what is happening, Jim goes to the observatory, where he finds a shocking revelation as he is informed by the system that the ship is not 4 months, but 90 years away from its destination, and that he's woken up far too early. Realizing the implications of this information, Jim attempts to contact Earth, only to learn that any response would take 55 years to arrive. Totally overwhelmed by the hopeless situation, Jim's despair starts to grow as he grabs the reality of living out the rest of his life alone in the spaceship. Moments later, as he wanders aimlessly, he stumbles upon the ship's bar and finds Arthur, an android bartender. At first, Jim was relieved to have some semblance of company, but he soon realizes Arthur's limited capacity to understand or help with his predicament. The bartender offers polite conversation, but no solutions to his questions, leaving Jim to continue with his isolation. As he continues to try to find ways to fix his predicament, Jim decides to focus on repairing his hibernation pod, and after gathering necessary tools, he works tirelessly to reactivate it. However, he fails over and over. Choosing not to give up, he attempts to break into the crew's hibernation chambers, but this too proves futile. Meanwhile, we see that system malfunctions continue to occur throughout the ship, and seeing this added to his worries. Feeling all alone, Jim turns to the bar as he tries to find some comfort in the drinks and Arthur's companionship. On one of such days, Arthur suggests that he make the most of his circumstances by using the ship's first-class amenities. Realizing this would be a good idea to pass time, Jim breaks into one of the gold-class sections and starts to use the high-end restaurants, game centers, and entertainment systems. And for a brief time, he manages to distract himself with these luxuries. However, the excitement soon wears off, leaving him even more aware of his loneliness. As weeks turn into months, Jim's mental state starts to deteriorate. And one night, while he was intoxicated and emotionally drained, he walks around the ship and soon finds himself near the hibernation pods. He eventually finds an airlock housing spacesuits for extravehicular activity, and driven by a mix of curiosity and depression, Jim wears one of the spacesuits and heads to the airlock. Then, with his hands trembling, he pulls the lever and presses the button to open the airlock door, unsure of what he hopes to find outside. Once outside the Avalon, Jim is captivated by the breathtaking view of space. The sheer vastness and beauty overwhelm him, but he's soon struck by the realization that he is the only conscious human witnessing this moment. Eventually, he returns inside and removes the spacesuit as he starts to contemplate his despicable state. In the end, he goes back to the airlock, but this time, without his suit as he prepares to end his life. However, at the very last moment, he changes his mind, retreats inside in panic until he accidentally slips on a bottle he had left on the floor. As he tries to gather himself, his attention is drawn to a woman in one of the hibernation pods. He eventually finds that her name is Aurora, and, feeling totally drawn to her, Jim searches her files in the ship's database and listens to her passenger interview. Her charisma, voice, and dreams captivate him, and he becomes deeply drawn to her. So, he continues to spend hours listening to her interviews, reading her writing, and even sitting beside her pod as he thinks about the kind of person she is. Days later at the bar, he discusses her work with Arthur, as he also recalls that he had left Earth seeking a better life, but that with his current situation, he is now destined never to reach his dream. Although he seems to have found his ideal companion, yet she remains inaccessible to him. However, as his obsession with Aurora starts to grow, the idea of waking her starts to form inside his head. But Jim knows the ethical implications of such action, and that bringing her out of hibernation would condemn her to the same fate as him. So, he decides against it. But when the loneliness and longing continues to tug at him, he eventually gives in. And on one fateful day, Jim activates Aurora's pod. As she awakens, Jim quickly goes to hide in his cabin. However, just like Jim, Aurora woke up confused and disoriented, and later on, when they eventually met, Aurora asked questions about their situation as she tried to come to terms with their condition. So Jim explains that they are the only two people awake on the ship, and then proceeds to show her the observatory and also tell her the unfortunate truth that the crew and main ship systems are inaccessible, and there's no way for them to return to hibernation. Shocked and panicked, Aurora immediately demands to return to her pod. However, Jim gently explains that the technology to re-enter hibernation isn't available on the ship, and this has left them stranded. Though she was initially worried for herself, Aurora soon realizes the reality around and tries to sympathize with Jim, as she imagines the loneliness he must have endured for over a year alone on the ship. But even at this, Aurora continues to remain determined to find a solution, while Jim becomes burdened by guilt over his decision to wake her. He even pleads with Arthur not to reveal his role in her waking Aurora. In the following days, Aurora eventually starts to adjust to life on the spaceship as she explores and investigates the hibernation pods. She even at times studies the ship's systems, as she keeps hoping that she finds a solution to their situation. But for Jim, he has already resigned himself to their predicament. As the days roll on, Aurora begins to accept her new reality as she starts to exercise to keep herself busy, but her frustrations continue to persist. Then, one day when she has an honest chat with Jim, she asks about his motivations for leaving Earth. Initially, he was not straightforward, but soon, he revealed that it is his desire to find a fresh start and a chance to build a meaningful life. In turn, Aurora shares her purpose that as a journalist, she had planned to document life on Homestead 2 for a year before returning to Earth. Now, it seems that those dreams are impossible for her. Seeing Aurora's growing despair, Jim tries to make an effort to lift her spirits. So, he takes her dancing as he shows her the ship's cinema, and even plays games with her. They also visit the bar, where Arthur entertains them with funny jokes. Slowly, Aurora begins to relax, and even though Jim's guilt lingers, he continues to keep finding ways to make amends in small, thoughtful ways. He even recreates a miniature replica of the Chrysler building for Aurora, which was a gesture that deeply moves her. In the end, their relationship deepens as they spend more time together. While on a date one day, Jim takes her for a spacewalk and gives her a chance to experience the same awesome view that had captivated him earlier. As they float weightlessly in space, they share an unforgettable moment of beauty and togetherness, and when they return inside, their bond solidifies and soon, they begin living as a couple. Aurora even moves into Jim's cabin, and they build a routine of eating, jogging, and experiencing the ship's wonders together. As Jim continues to explore the ship, he finds a hydroponics bay where he picks flowers for Aurora. And on her birthday, he plans a special celebration. After dinner at one of the ship's elegant restaurants, they visit the bar, where Jim prepares to propose with a handmade ring. However, as he steps away to finalize his surprise for Aurora, Arthur unintentionally reveals Jim's secret, that he was the one who woke her up. Aurora was devastated by this news, and she immediately confronts Jim when he returns. Her feelings of anger and betrayal were palpable as she stormed away, leaving Jim in despair. In the following days, their relationship remains strained as Jim attempts severally to speak to her, but she keeps avoiding him, as she was unwilling to face the man who, in her eyes, has robbed her of her future. Then one night, unable to contain her emotions, she storms into Jim's cabin, jumps on him punching and kicking. She wanted to punish him for taking her life away. In the following days, Jim tries to reach her through the ship's communication system, as he explains his actions and confesses that he had fallen in love with her while she was still in the pod. And that was the reason why he did what he did. However, Aurora is unmoved because her pain and anger had overshadowed any sympathy in her, and she eventually tells him she cannot forgive him for what he has done. As the days pass, the Avalon begins to exhibit more severe malfunctions. And one night, while Jim is in his cabin, the ship experiences a critical error that causes the main command to shut down. Later on, as he rides an elevator, it malfunctions dangerously and he barely escapes from the inside. In the meantime, when Aurora walks into the main concourse and notices a tree Jim has planted there, she eventually decides to go to the cantina instead. There she saw that even the food dispensary was also malfunctioning. Suddenly, they hear a voice over the ship's communication system. Eventually, we see that it was the voice of Gus Mancuso, the ship captain, who was asking about the tree. Both Jim and Aurora eventually rush to meet him. After introducing themselves, they recount their predicament to the man who was puzzled as he was unable to comprehend how 3 pods had malfunctioned. Suspecting that something is wrong, they all head to the bridge to investigate, and there, Mancuso discovers an underlying issue with the ship and that most of the system's data must be checked manually. But as they leave the bridge, a maintenance robot nearly falls on them as Jim and Aurora explain that they have noticed malfunctions happening across the entire vessel. When they eventually reach the bridge, Mancuso shows them how to gather the necessary diagnostic data and begins investigating the hibernation pods. While working, Jim confesses to Mancuso about waking Aurora, and although Mancuso is appalled by Jim's actions, he decides to set aside his judgment to focus on the larger issue at hand. Moments later, when Mancuso and Aurora discuss her pod's failure on the bridge, he expresses his sympathies with her, but then he admits that he cannot reverse the damage. Eventually, Jim returns to them with yet another broken robot, as they start to notice that Mancuso was suffering from hibernation sickness. So, he excuses himself to rest, but almost collapses on his way as he starts coughing up blood. That night, Aurora was unable to sleep, so she decided to take a swim in the ship's pool. Suddenly, the gravity inside the ship fails, and this causes her to float helplessly as water starts to engulf her. Just as she is about to drown, the gravity drive resets, and she barely escapes. Alarmed by this occurrence, Aurora and Jim quickly rush to meet up with Mancuso. And together, they return to the bridge and begin piecing together the ship's history. That was when Mancuso deduces that an event that had happened 2 years earlier had damaged a critical system, forcing the ship to overcompensate. Unless they identify and fix the root cause, the entire vessel, and everyone aboard, will be doomed. However, as they search for the problem, Mancuso collapses again. And when Jim and Aurora take him to the infirmary, it becomes clear that he is dying from irreversible complications. Eventually, the trio gather round in the observatory, and Mancuso, who now knows that his time is short, hands his ID bracelet to Jim and entrusts them with saving the ship. Then, moments later, he succumbs to his illness. As if echoing their loss, the ship's lights turn an ominous red, and the vessel begins to shake violently. So Jim and Aurora quickly run to the engineering deck to try to address the crisis. But on the way, another failure affects the gravity drive, and they see even Arthur malfunctioning. So, Jim deactivates Arthur before continuing their mission. When they reach the power plant, they eventually locate the issue as they find that the asteroid strike from the beginning of the movie had breached the hull and caused widespread damage. But as they open the hatch, Aurora is nearly sucked out, followed by Jim, who desperately clings to the hatch before sealing the breach. However, their relief is short-lived as Jim soon realizes that multiple breaches exist in the ship. And when they traced the asteroid's trajectory, they discovered that it had struck the reactor control computer. Jim believes they can replace the damaged parts, and they eventually manage to locate and install replacements. However, venting the reactor proves unsuccessful. That is when Jim realizes that the vent doors must be opened manually, a task that would require someone to go outside the ship. Jim volunteers for the dangerous mission, and before leaving, he gives Aurora Mancuso's ID bracelet, telling her he might not return. But as she helps him prepare, Aurora pleads with him to come back as she tells him that she can't endure life inside the ship alone. In the end, she returns to monitor the reactor as Jim exits the airlock. As Jim approaches the vent, Aurora is suddenly injured by a bolt from the overheated reactor. Meanwhile, Jim starts to struggle with the external vent doors as he realizes that he must manually hold them open for the reactor to cool. So, he tells Aurora over the comms to initiate the venting process. But she hesitates as she is horrified that she would lose him. However, Jim reminds her that this is the only way to save the lives of the sleeping passengers. Reluctantly, Aurora follows his instructions. And although the venting process succeeds, the powerful fumes propel Jim away from the ship, breaking off his tether and leaving him adrift in space. And as he continues to drift off, the pressure in his suit begins to drop. He manages to contact Aurora and explains the dire situation. Determined to save him, Aurora rushes to retrieve the second spacesuit in an attempt to rescue him. But Jim apologizes once more for waking her with his voice filled with regret. However, even at this, Aurora quickly wears the suit and steps out, but then she discovers that her tether is too short to reach him. Fortunately, just as she is pulled back, she manages to grab Jim's tether and pull him back. After dragging him inside the ship, Aurora soon realizes that he is already dead. But she couldn't let it be. So, she quickly uses Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical pod's protocols and initiate an emergency resuscitation on Jim. The pod works automatically, administering the necessary medications and eventually reviving Jim. In that moment, Aurora totally forgives him, and their relationship is restored. And together, they repair Arthur and even give Mancuso a dignified space burial. Eventually, Jim reveals a discovery that he can now modify the medical pod to function as a hibernation chamber. So, he tells Aurora to use it to complete the journey to Homestead 2. However, Aurora tells him that she had chosen to stay awake with him and share the years ahead together. After this, Jim proposes to marry her, and together they embrace their new life on the ship. Then, towards the end of the movie, we see that 88 years later, the Avalon has reached Homestead 2, and that the now awakened crew and passengers find the ship transformed, with Aurora's message playing over the speakers and recounting the extraordinary life she and Jim had shared together. And that is the story of the movie, The Passenger. If you enjoyed the recap, consider dropping a like on the video and subscribing to the channel. Also turn on notifications to know when next we upload a video. Thanks for watching.